please go ahead. And it takes, once you've pressed it, it gives us 10 seconds about of overlap. So
Yeah,
we'll just wait for that.
And Robert Baines, would you announce the name of the webinar before we get into?
Indeed. All right, we should be just about live. All right, thanks so much, Joseph. Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Baines. I am the President and CEO of the NATO Association of Canada, a charitable NGO dedicated to informing Canadians about the value of security and the importance of NATO. Most Canadians don't usually have to think about these ideas. It does not come before them in their day-to-day life. They're busy with their jobs, their family, their social aspects. It's always a challenge. But I would like to say that we've got a constant push here at the NATO Association to make sure Canadians do hear those issues, that they are aware of, that they do consider how much Canada is affected to the rest of the rules-based international order and the international current issues. I do hear that there is an echo. I believe that is fixed now. Sorry about that. But the NATO Association constantly puts on, if you do hear an echo, it may be because you've got YouTube on at the same time as Zoom. So that could be it. But NATO is a really important issue for Canadians. We constantly put on events that host our different NATO ambassadors, various policy experts, generals, members of the different international rules-based order institutions that Canada is a part of. Really what we're looking at is relationships, building discussions, making sure that most Canadians are involved in all of these. So thank you to all of you for tuning in. It's a really important issue that all of us must be eager to be part of these discussions. It's not something that's normal in most people's lives, and it has to be. So I'm thrilled now to introduce the rest of our discussion. When we were coming up with some names, we talked about the luxury of energy security. Energy security is something that has been talked about for many years, obviously. Certainly the past decade, it's been a growing issue. At the NATO Association, we've been talking about it a significant amount. Dr. Robert Cutler, our senior fellow here at the NATO Association for Energy Security, has constantly been bashing away at the requirement of Canada and so many other countries to pay attention to the importance of energy security. With the invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, that quickly came to reality. Everybody in Europe already gravitated towards this conflict, suddenly started having to look in their own backyards to their own energy security. Canada, which so long was ignoring this urgency, now has to take it in a very serious way and take a very serious look at what our policies are, how we are helping the rest of our allies, and making sure that nobody is left behind in a terrible pit of energy lack. So today we're going to talk about all of these issues, and to bring us through it is Dr. Robert Cutler. As I mentioned, Dr. Cutler has been our senior fellow in energy security for about, I guess, 5 or 6 years now, Robert? He has a storied career in both academia and in many different policy circles. He's also a fellow of the CGAI, which we're thrilled to share him with. And since, I guess, the past 5 years, he has been somewhat of a Twitter commentator extraordinaire. So Robert, please take it away and introduce our panelists, and let's get this discussion going. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Robert Baines. Yes, the webinar will address all of the things that you mentioned and more. With your introduction, I will go straight to the panel. I will mention their names, and I will address each one briefly in turn when she begins to speak. We have Tracy Schuchart, who will go first, Dr. Ellen Wald second, and Velina Chekhodova will be third. Tracy is the founder CEO of Hill Tower Resource Advisors. She started her career at the Chicago Board of Trade. She's a go-to person for the legacy media in energy market analysis, Bloomberg, Fox, CNBC, to mention only three, and has extensive presence on the non-legacy media in podcasts and long-form interviews. Her original training was in political science and international relations at University of Southern California, and she also lived in French Canada for 5 years. So, Tracy, you have agreed Tracy can speak about anything under the sun or in the ground, but she's agreed to give us the benefit of her wisdom on today liquefied natural gas, LNG, Canada's role in the world, and Canada's energy diplomacy, reaching out towards Europe and East Asia. Thank you, Tracy. Please take it away.
Well, good morning. Thank you for inviting me, first of all. So really, I just wanted to talk about energy security for a minute. So energy plays an important role in national security of any given country as it powers the economic engine. So energy security is the association between national security and the availability of natural resources for energy consumption. Access to cheaper energy has become essential to functioning of modern economies. However, the uneven distribution of energy supplies among countries has led to significant vulnerabilities, and international energy relations have also contributed to globalization of the world, leading to energy security and energy vulnerability at the same time. So threats to, say, national security include political domestic instability of a government, of a major producing country, for example, a change in leadership or environmental values or regime change. Also reliance on foreign countries for oil, as we have seen recently. Also foreign in-state conflict, religious wars, civil wars, foreign exporters' interests, foreign non-state actors targeting supply and transportation of oil resources, for example, theft. We've seen a lot of that in Africa. A manipulation of energy supplies, either by mega corporations or state-backed racketeering. Competition over energy resources, for example, biofuel versus oil versus coal versus natural gas versus nuclear versus wind or solar, et cetera. Unreliable energy stores, in other words, it's hard to have wind power as a baseload without like a lithium-ion grid expansion. Also attacks on energy infrastructure, terrorism, accidents, we see those all the time, as well as natural disasters. And since the Ukraine invasion, energy security has especially come to the forefront as global energy flows were upended in light of sanctions on Russian supplies on natural gas, and LNG have become particularly increasingly important globally as a cheap, reliable, and transition source of energy. So finally, turning to Canada on this matter. As of 2021, Canada is estimated to have 1.373 trillion cubic feet of natural gas resources. That's equal to about 200 years of current annual demand. Canada produces 17.94 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas, most of this obviously coming from Alberta, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. And exports average 8.91 billion cubic feet today. And this is going to the United States, as Canada does not currently have LNG export facilities. As a result, the United States imports Canadian natural gas via pipeline, and where it is chilled, then resold for higher price and exported as LNG to the rest of the globe via United States growing export facilities. So it should be imperative for Canada to reach other markets and expand its customer base. But unfortunately, this is being currently thwarted by the current government and various regulatory and environmental battles over pipeline and export facility expansion. So as recently as August of 2022, and I want to back up a little bit and say, other countries are looking to Canada for LNG specifically. So as recently as August of 2022, German Chancellor Scholz visited Canada in hopes of securing LNG contracts with Canada to help ease the shift away from Russian natural gas. But Trudeau downplayed the economic viability and speed of setting up new export terminals. And in the end, Scholz left Canada with no promises of LNG. Instead, a hydrogen alliance was formed and aimed of selling Germany hydrogen, accelerating its efforts to export the clean fuel to Germany by 2025. Germany then subsequently went to Qatar and secured a 15-year LNG contract, the first ever with this country, as well as Mexico, where President Obrador agreed to build a $5 billion export hub facility to help serve its European customers. Then in January of this year, Japan came calling on Canada for LNG supplies, aimed at seeking replacements for Russian LNG as well. In the end, Prime Minister Kishida also left with no promises of LNG, with Trudeau saying that we, quote unquote, we know that being a reliable supplier of energy is important, but even if we talk about things like LNG and other traditional sources of energy, we know the world is aggressively and meaningfully moving toward decarbonization. Meanwhile, Japan's government continues to urge importers to continue investing and securing overseas supplies. So essentially, Canada is being left behind in the global demand as global demand for LNG is growing, and as LNG is growing for the foreseeable future, as it's remained on the sidelines up to date. That said, there is light. There is some light. Despite the current government, there are 3 significant projects that are taking shape, which will change this and open the door to other markets. So first, there's the largest private sector construction project in Canada's history, the Shell-led LNG project, which is to take shape on Canada's west coast to reach Asian customers in British Columbia. It's the first phase is expected to produce 14 million tons of chilled LNG per year to export again to Asia. This is where Canada particularly has an advantage over the US, as it's much closer to Asia, obviously, than the Gulf Coast, leaving shipping charges significantly less and shipping times. And this project should be completed by 2025. The second project is the wood fiber LNG export facility construction that is supposed to begin in September of this year. It's a subsidiary of Singapore's RGE Group and has received finally environmental approval from British Columbia. It is the first industrial project in Canada to recognize a non-treaty Indigenous government, the Squamish Nation, as the full project regulator. Wood fiber will produce 2.1 million tons of LNG annually, and completion date is 2027. And the third project, which is still facing many hurdles to overcome and current wait status on permits, but it's a $3 billion Cedar LNG facility owned and proposed by the Haisla Nation. It's just been granted environmental assessment certificate by BC, but bringing it one step closer to start date, still a lot of hurdles on that one. That said, between all 3 of those projects, that amount really pales in comparison to the United States export capacity. And the U.S. has much smaller reserves. So global LNG, I kind of want to go in some. We're going to expand out a little bit to global LNG as I kind of wrap this up. Global oil and gas demand out to 2050 is only expected to grow according to estimates from all these three-letter energy agencies, EIA, IEA. EIA will take their numbers, expects global energy demand to increase 47% over the next 30 years, driven by obviously population, economic growth, particularly in developing Asian countries. This will require increased oil and natural gas production, absent some technological breakthrough that we don't know about yet, or significant policy changes. Liquid fuel and natural gas is to make up over 58% of that of global energy demand by 2050, compared to renewables at only 27%. We're even seeing coal demand in emerging markets is also forecast to grow out to 2050, according to the latest estimates, as coal is obviously a necessary fuel provides a stable baseload, particularly for the developing world, and it's very cheap. So really, in sum, I want to, Canada holds the fourth largest oil and gas reserves in the world. I think Canada should and could play a much larger role in providing its abundant oil and gas resources to a growing global demand.
Thank you, Tracy. I should alert the audience that this is but the first round. Each speaker will speak for about as long as Tracy did, about 10 minutes. Then there will be a second round, which I will explain at that time. And after that, there'll be a Q&A. And if you have any questions that occur to you in the meantime, you are invited to drop them into the YouTube chat, where I neglected to introduce Dr. Joseph DeSapio, who's the program editor in the energy security program that I direct. And he will very ably sift through them, combine them if necessary, moderate them, and also moderate the Q&A when it comes to, and he will state the questions to the panelists. And if you have a question, if your question, by the way, it implicates one of the panelists in particular, if you, for example, have a question for Tracy in particular on the basis of what she's just said, please indicate in your YouTube chat drop that message that your question is directed to Tracy or to any of the particular panelists. That will help us to manage the tsunami of questions that we are going to have. Second up, we have Dr. Ellen Wald, who is, I'm happy to say, like myself, a fellow at the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. She's also Senior Fellow, Global Energy Center, Atlantic Council. She's president of Transversal Consulting, energy consulting firm, and co-founder of Washington Ivy Advisors, the author of Saudi Inc., the Arabian Kingdom's Pursuit of Profit and Power, very popular book in the energy cognoscenti, amongst the energy cognoscenti. She's a graduate of Princeton University and holds the PhD in political science from Boston University. Ellen has kindly acceded to the request to continue Tracy's outreach from Canada to Europe and East Asia, and to focus her attention not on gas, but on oil, and on the demand in Europe, both before and after February 2022, for demand for oil and oil products, where it's coming from. I think she'll touch on increased Russian exports to India, and how those are being refined for export with the American okay for it. So Ellen, thank you for being here, and please, the floor is yours.
Let me unmute myself. Thank you for having me. I have to say one thing, that my PhD is actually in history, not political science, where those two departments are always slightly at odds. So I'm actually a historian by training, and my book is about really the history of the Saudi oil industry and Saudi Arabia. But today we're going to focus more on the European situation. So I want to talk a little bit about where Europe sourced most of its crude oil. I'm going to focus first just on crude oil before the Russia conflagration, and then talk about how that's changed and what some of the implications in terms of the security situation and the relationship between the US and Canada and Europe, and how that may impact this changing relationship. And then I'll, of course, talk a little bit about where we're seeing Russian crude oil going if it's not going to Europe. And so I'm going to just briefly share my screen if I can. Okay, hopefully that worked. So hopefully we're looking at a chart showing EU crude oil imports by country of origin from 2021. And this information comes from the EU website. So this is their own accounting, and it gives you kind of a breakdown of where crude oil was coming from. So Russia had really the lion's share of the market at 25%. Then you got Norway, 10%, United States, 9%, Kazakhstan, Libya, both at 8%, Nigeria and Iraq, 7%, Saudi Arabia and UK at 5%, and then other is 16%. Basically, all of the countries comprising other are just smaller than the 5%. Now, if you take a quick look at this chart, this is going to show you how that's changed. Basically, this gives you where we're seeing crude oil come from to the EU in the third quarter of 2022, which is the latest data that we have. And as you can see, Europe's still getting quite a bit of oil from Russia. We've got Russia at 14%. It's actually like 14.3, I think, so close to 15%. But the United States has really come up there at 11, almost 12%. Norway's at 11. Saudi Arabia has jumped to 9%. Iraq jumped up to 8%. Then we've got Kazakhstan, Libya, Nigeria, UK, and then others also jumped. So we're seeing a more diverse base for Europe drawing on its oil from. And I'll see if maybe people are interested if we can make these charts available outside of this talk. Anyway, just to give you a few quick references. So the ban on Russian oil is really only on seaborne oil. And so Europe can still receive Russian oil through pipelines, namely the Druzhba pipeline. That's the big source of Russian oil to Europe. But the impact of this is the fact that Russian seaborne oil imports have been banned is that Europe's sources of crude oil have become more diverse, which is generally a good thing when you're talking about energy security, particularly if you have to import. If you think about back like to the United States in the 1970s, they were getting a huge amount of oil from the Middle East, and suddenly the Arab OPEC states decided to cut that off, and suddenly there were huge shortages. So you don't want to have all your eggs in one basket, but the fact that they have to source from other areas that aren't Russia makes it more expensive. It takes longer for the oil to reach Europe. Transport by ship can be more expensive and longer. It pollutes more. But it is interesting to see who has really emerged as more significant players in the European crude oil market. The United States has really emerged there. And that's very interesting because, the US is really a newcomer on the crude oil, global crude oil market to begin with. We didn't even allow crude oil exports before, I think, at the very end of Barack Obama's second term was when they decided to revoke the ban on crude oil exports. So this is really a new thing for the United States, but it's really grown by leaps and bounds. And in fact, one of the things we've seen since the ban on Russian oil is that there was US oil that was going to India, and a lot of that oil is now actually going to Europe. It can be a faster journey, actually. So US oil exports have increased about 22% in this is between 2022 and 2021 to a peak of 3.6 million barrels a day. Though it's important to remember that some of the releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the US were an important part of this, and those releases can't necessarily be sustained. So it's not totally, we're probably not going to see exports remain that high for a long in the longer term. The Netherlands was actually the second highest destination for US oil exports at 10.2%. And that was about a little over 350,000 barrels a day, followed by the UK. And that's data comes from the US Energy Information Administration. Now, on the Canadian side, in March of 2022, Canada committed to increasing its oil exports by about 5% to help offset Europe's loss of Russian oil. That would come out to about 200,000 barrels a day. But Canada's ability to increase its oil exports to Europe is really limited because there's no pipeline to carry oil produced in Western Canada to the Atlantic coast. So essentially, it has to go through the United States, and we all know that there's some limitations on that because the expansion of the Keystone pipeline was never built. That was the Keystone XL pipeline that never ended up getting built. So there's a limit to how much can be sent through U.S. Through to the U.S. to leave from U.S. ports. Some of the implications that I think we're seeing from the effects of Russia-Ukraine on the oil market and geopolitics as it relates to Europe, and also the relationship with the United States and Canada. So Europe, I think it really elevates actually the US-EU relationship, because prior to this, yes, the US was sending oil to Europe, but now the US has become a much more important player in ensuring that Europe has sufficient supplies of crude oil. Europe was ranked as the second as a regional destination for US crude oil exports in 2022, representing 42% of the US export market. So more US oil is heading to Europe. Now, interestingly, that actually means that less US oil is heading to Canada. Canada actually dropped to the fourth largest destination for US crude oil exports for the first time since the end of the US crude oil export ban in 2015. Prior to 2020, Canada had been the single largest destination for US crude oil exports for over 20 years. Now, in general, a lot of that Canada and the US have had a very intense or in-depth crude oil relationship. US might send crude oil to Canada, it gets refined into products that come back, and vice versa. There's a lot of intertwining. In fact, when I talk about energy security, I don't like to even talk about US energy security, because really we should be talking about North American energy security, because the US and Canadian oil industries are so intertwined. So I just want to say that this is, potentially could be changing the relationships when you think about, it's not necessarily a negative change to the US-Canada-European relationship, but as you see shifts in the flow of crude oil, that changes economic relationships, and that can have an effect on the balance of power and the balance of power geopolitically. Another important thing to note is that Europe is now importing more oil from the Middle East, and that comes with a whole new set of diplomatic concerns. So whereas before they may have been importing a little from Iraq, a little from Libya, a little from Saudi Arabia, now they're importing more from Iraq, more from Saudi Arabia, more from Libya. Some of those regions are not particularly stable sources of oil, and of course come with all sorts of other stability concerns. I'm going to very briefly, because I'm running out of time, talk a little bit about the European diesel situation. So over the past few years, about 40% of the diesel imported by the European Union has come from Russia. This did not drop initially after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Throughout 2022, the EU imported about 500,000 barrels a day of diesel from Russia. Then in January 2023, this was supposed to all change in February with new sanctions. So one of the things that we did see in January was they were starting to decline the diesel exports from Russia to the EU. And so they started to make up less. I think the diesel imports basically fell to 2% once the sanctions took effect. And the largest increase, and this is a very interesting thing, I think people will be interested to note, in diesel import volumes into Northwest Europe has come from Saudi Arabia. Now, most people think of Saudi Arabia as just, you know, a crude oil export. That's what they do. They drill oil, they drill, you know, holes in the ground, and oil comes out and they send it to the world. That's not an accurate picture of what Saudi Arabia does. And they have been expanding their refining, their domestic refining for a long time. And they are now supplying a huge amount of diesel produced in Saudi Arabia, you know, to the rest of the world. Now, the question is, what kind of oil is being used to produce that diesel? Is it Saudi oil? Maybe, maybe not. Could actually be Russian oil. So Saudi Arabia can import either Russian oil, or they can import like a product that's kind of halfway to diesel, and then refine that the rest of the way to diesel, and then sell it to Europe. And that is perfectly okay under these sanctions. And not only can Saudi Arabia do this, but Indonesia can do it, China can do it, Turkey is doing it, India is doing it, and a lot of countries are basically taking Russian oil, refining it in their own refineries, and then selling it to all these countries that say, we're not going to buy Russian crude oil, we're not going to buy Russian products, but we'll buy your products made from Russian oil. And so that's become a big market. And so it's something interesting to consider, that a lot of these countries, not just crude oil producers, but other countries, are taking advantage of these sanctions to make money producing products and then selling them to Europe.
Thank you for that broad yet detailed overview, Ellen. We now pass to the third panelist, Velina Zakharova. She is joining us from Austria. Thank you for dialing in. She is the founder of the consulting company, the geopolitical consulting company For a Conscious Experience, FACE. She's former director of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy, and a member of the Strategy and Security Policy Advisory Board of the Scientific Commission at the Austrian Federal Defense Ministry. Velina earned the master's degree at Heidelberg University in South Asian Studies, and also holds a bachelor's degree from the University of World and National Economy in Sofia. Velina, as you can see, we've zoomed out a little bit. Tracy focused on Canada and Canada's energy relations. Ellen took that to Europe and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and Russia, and now we're going to continue zooming out. And Velina is going to build upon what we've already heard to discuss, as I understand it, the global implications of the energy situation, including the relations between China and Russia, including India's relations with the United States, and generally giving us the big picture with further necessary details. So thank you, Velina, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Robert. And I'm now in a very privileged position to follow up with my 10 minutes based on what Tracy and Ellen already have contributed to. So as we've learned, energy is the linchpin of geopolitics. And right now we are in the middle of significant systemic shifts that are affecting all socioeconomic networks of our global system. And one of course, the main, system shifts is very much linked to the energy transition, as we've heard from the many examples given by Tracy and Ellen. So when we actually try to extrapolate from the world of energy in the world of geopolitics, what's going on, we need to consider this as one of the significant triggers, but also one of the significant factors of change. Now, let's move a little bit towards the Indo-Pacific region, and we face, of course, a region with significant changes taking place in terms of demographics, in terms of economics, so geo-economics, but also in terms of geopolitics. And this is, of course, the Indo-Pacific decade, with one particular country that, according to many experts, has already peaked in terms of demographics, but certainly has not managed to convert its geo-economic cloud into global or at least regional geopolitical power projection, and that is certainly China. So we are about to see how, now that we have the new old Chinese leadership, with Xi Jinping managing to solidify his position within the highest echelons of power, going to practically, what I assume, present a new, more assertive, more nationalistic, and more global strategy for China, starting, of course, with the Indo-Pacific. Then what we have is the second Asian giant, which is India. And the rise of India is going to affect not only the Indo-Pacific, but actually the global affairs per se. That means that being in the middle of the what I call bifurcation of the global system, with the two clear centers of power centered around the transatlantic community on the one hand, with the US and its allies on both sides of the Atlantic, and now increasingly with the Indo-Pacific allies that America has been forging over the last several years, and with China being the second center of power, at least for now, in this Asian corner of the world, already projecting and creating centrifugal forces in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America, and to some extent in Europe. We are going to observe, of course, how India is going to position itself and how India is going to behave. And I argue that India is going to bet on India, practically trying to become as strong as possible and as self-reliant as possible, which of course means that it will very much also base its relations with third countries while following its calculus in terms of self-reliance in the energy sector. And then, of course, we are going to observe how this dichotomy in the world, and specifically in the global affairs, is going to create a lot of tension, a lot of turbulence at the regional levels of power, with all these regional actors that have certain leverage and certain power projection, trying to somehow navigate without getting caught in a binary world, without being faced with binary choices. That means, being faced with the decision of either taking the side of United States or taking the side of China. We have already observed some examples even before Russia launched the war against Ukraine. And that was the example with Australia, that entered the Security and Defense Pact with the United States and with UK, despite its geo-economic clout with China, specifically when it comes to commodities. And of course, it's had a lot of negative impact for the bilateral relationship between Australia and China. Now, I argue that this kind of modus vivendi of forging new kind of partnerships based on security and defense first, and of course all other elements of partnership coming second, is going to emerge more and more at the forefront of international relations. And here, because the topic is of course about Canada and Europe, I think that these specific actors will be caught in some kind of unpleasant scenarios. Specifically, of course, being based in Europe, I can talk of the European, players that are currently in this kind of behavior, if you like, specifically the Western European actors, France and Germany, which are trying to go back to business when it comes to the relations with China, while still playing the role of a strategic, partner of the United States. And this is exactly the scenario I'm outlining for you that will be no longer available in the next years to come. Then again, of course, this bifurcation that I mentioned is already affecting the old continent, in a sense that, of course, it is very much based on considerations how to provide for the energy. And here once again we see that with the reducing of the dependence on Russian commodities, this dependence has been overwhelming in all relevant sectors of fossil fuels, but also we still have a dependence on also on oil, gas, and to some extent other important critical commodities. So with the reduction of this dependence, there are new players. And of course, that would mean that when some of the European states will certainly prefer to have, a supplier such as the United States that is also the most reliable security guarantor. And in a sense, we are going to enter this unpleasant debate where some states in the north, in Central, in Eastern Europe are going to, of course, let's say, put security first once again, including energy security, and European integration, or whatever, call it whatever you like, kind of European strategic sovereignty or whatsoever. In my view, this whole debate died on the 24th of February 2022, but still a lot of bureaucrats and a lot of decision makers here in Europe want to keep it alive. So this would come second. And here, once again, I, let's say, foresee a kind of a risk of bifurcation, of creating a gap among the European NATO members based on, as I said, specifically the approach to security in general, energy security in particular, and also based on the approach to Russia in short term, and I have to add China in middle to long term. Now, you also, Robert, asked about the relationship between Russia and China. And once again, we actually see how overlooked this strategic dimension of the decision making or regarding this war has been. What do I mean is that throughout the last 13 months, the main debate was, of course, at least here in Europe, about how to help Ukraine sustain the Russian military attacks. But there was no whatsoever future of European or, let's say, global order. And I argue that, in fact, Russia has sided with China prior to taking the move on Ukraine, given these global systemic shifts, and given the fact that Russia will no longer be a systemic player, but still has the chance to become what I call a first-tier geopolitical player, let's say a wild card in the newly emerging systemic competition between United States and China. If Moscow is successful in the war against Ukraine, if it manages to subjugate Ukraine, to take over the territory, the demographics will be a positive factor, but also the access to critical, in fact, natural resources, a topic not being discussed at all here in Europe, in a sense that this war is also, among many other things, about natural resources, about fossil fuels, and about the critical minerals and rare earths that an energy transition will need. A final point, when it comes to the bifurcation, we see that the whole debate about the energy transition has been bifurcated in a sense as well. What I mean by that is that there is this kind of dichotomy right now between the understanding powers in the West have to stick to this narrative that they are going to decarbonize per se. So it's just, a settled issue. And yet they have decided this in 2015 without actually paying attention to the dependencies, or let's say to the access to those required minerals. And at the very same time, what we are going to observe is Asian powers which will actually bet on both on fossil fuels and on building up on the energy transition and the renewables. So once again, we will see a very much kind of hardcore realpolitik competition in that field as well, when it comes to access to the classic fossil fuels, but also to the new renewables. And I will stop here and we can move on in the next round.
Thank you, Velina. And I said that I would explain the second round when we got to it. This is the second round. What the second round goes as follows, and after that there's the Q&A, so stick around. This is the chance beginning for the panelists to talk to each other, and we get to eavesdrop. I'm going to ask in the same order as they spoke, Tracy, if she has any comments, specifically on what Ellen and Velina had said. Ellen comments on the other two, and Velina comments on Tracy and Ellen. Then the panelists know this, and I'm telling you, the audience, so that you understand what's going to happen, is that when Velina finishes her comments on what Tracy and Ellen had to say, then without intervention from me, they know that that is their cue to start discussion amongst themselves. They get to disagree with each other. They get to ask each other questions. They get to have a round table, and we get to eavesdrop. And that's going to go on as long as it goes, as long as it takes for them to exhaust whatever they have, everything they have to say. I'm not going to interrupt them. I'm just going to sit like you are going to sit and listen to them. And when, after the appropriate time, they will have said everything that they can think up to say to one another, then we will pass to the question and answer, and I'll briefly explain that when we get there. So I start now with the second round. Tracy, you've heard what Ellen and Velina have to say. Do you have any comments to offer on their propositions? Tracy, you're muted.
Sorry about that. To Velina, I'm not really a comment, but I was wondering what your thoughts were, or to expand on sort of China's new role as this peace negotiator. A little bit as far as what we've seen between, Russia and Ukraine and Saudi Arabia and Iran.
Well, in my view, first and foremost, yes, indeed, China mediated to get the Iranians and Saudis together, but I argue that it did not happen without Russian help, as we know about the geopolitical rapprochement between Iran and Russia certainly helped a lot to get Iran on board. So here I think the calculus is that, well, from Chinese point of view, we are going to be your biggest client. You need us as your biggest client. United States is, as we've heard also from, Ellen's presentation, that, is already one of the most significant fossil fuels exporters in the world, not only in the oil sector, also in the LNG sector, as you know, so gas and oil.
Velina, if I could just ask you to hold that for your own turn, in order to give Ellen the chance, if Tracy has exhausted yet her comments on that may be more also energy specific related, concerning the different sectors of the energy, the different subsectors of the energy sector. And then Velina, you'll be the last one to comment on the other two, and then you can pick up your answer to Tracy during that, if that's okay with you. So Tracy, was that the only question or comment that you had for either of your co-participants?
Yeah, for right now. So I can pass that to Ellen.
Okay, fair enough. Ellen, do you have any comments? We'll save the questions actually for the general discussion. Do you have any comments on the energy specific or less energy specific aspects that Tracy or Velina had to mention, or anything else that you want to add that you didn't get to say in the first round?
I guess I will. I mean, Velina talked quite a bit about India kind of emerging as a player, and I guess one of the interesting things that I had prepared but didn't get to was the fact that Russia has really opened up this brand new market in India for its crude oil, and is exporting a lot of Russian oil to India, and I think that really speaks to her point that India is out for India's best interests, and India's best interests are cheap crude oil. And kind of like Tracy had said in the beginning of her talk, that access to cheap or inexpensive energy is really vital for growing economies and security in this world. And I think India in particular faces a very kind of a conundrum, because their only domestic source of energy really is coal. And that's very bad, both for pollution and for the world. And so they face a really difficult time transitioning away from heavy coal use, because they have to import oil and natural gas. And so I guess, I'm kind of wondering how they see India's, potential for reducing its coal dependence in a world where, oil prices are extremely volatile. It could go up to 100, or it could not go up to 100, and where Europe has suddenly become a big player in the LNG market, and that doesn't leave a lot of LNG for places like Pakistan, which has basically said we're going back to coal because we can't afford to buy LNG cargoes, and and India. So I would kind of say how do they see that those things affecting these more developing economies like India and Pakistan.
Okay, thanks, Ellen. I would suggest, Velina, that you pick up now your response to Tracy and address at the same time the issues that Ellen raised. And this will, in fact, be entering the general discussion amongst the three of you. And you can turn the tables around, Velina, and ask them questions too. In fact, we hope you will. So it's all yours.
Yes, I have questions for both Tracy and Ellen. Okay, so I will take on from where I stopped. So practically the way I see this mediation role in the particular case of Iran-Saudi Arabia deal is that the biggest client sets the new conditions, and that is that we need more stability, we need more predictability in the region. Now that United States is no longer that much dependent on energy from this region, and is having this focus on the Indo-Pacific. We are your biggest client, and we want this to happen. And I think that the Russians were very much helping in facilitating this kind of talks. The very fact that we've seen a lot of meetings, post factum meetings, following this deal. Think of the Hamas meetings, in Moscow and that kind of thing. So it comes to show that we may see also kind of, let's say, frozen conflict in Yemen, once again, based on the fact that these two come along, at least in the short term, and then again, a kind of preliminary stability, so that they can focus more on economic ties, exporting infrastructure corridors. Think of all these goodies that China is bringing in, and from Russian point of view, it makes perfect sense. They have to make sure that the military stability is not threatened there, military presence there is not threatened, and so on. But now, moving from this regional success towards the top of the system, having this most overwhelming war the old continent since the end of the World War II, I think that here it's more about projecting rather than in real intentions. I think that China wants to project to the global south and to countries in third parts of the world. We are on par with the United States. We can actually draft peace plans. We can actually talk to the aggressor And we have zero problem to go to Moscow because we can. And nobody can stop us. Nobody can prevent us. And now the Americans are talking about the possibility of, providing military aid to Russia, from China to Russia. Well, the very fact that they're talking about it is already PR for China. I mean, I still don't see clear signs, clear signals pointing to that actually China is providing military aid to Russia. There is indeed the supply of dual use for sure. And there is indeed a lot going on in the gray zone of, bypassing the Western sanctions for sure. But the very fact that right now, China is profiling itself as this global player is what I think they really seek to show. And then, of course, they're preparing for the exit plan, for the plan B. Plan A is to provide the main lifeline to Russia and to help Russia actually win. This is plan A. But what if plan A doesn't work out? What if Russia loses the war? Because Ukraine is willing to fight and the West is willing to provide military support to Ukraine. So what if Russia loses? They still have this plan B where they can say to the world, well, we actually draft a peace plan. We talk to the aggressor. We try to convince them, to go to the negotiation table. And we, by the way, can actually participate in the reconstruction of Ukraine. So in a sense, now they want also to call Ukraine and to talk to the Ukrainian president. So in a sense, I think that they actually work in both directions, let's put it that way, without actually having the intention to really facilitate a peace plan, at least for now. Let's be real about it. If Russia wins against Ukraine, China wins too, because it would mean that the United States will be faced with two-front scenario, and it will have to remain involved on the old continent. It will have to, get engaged with the European partners, at least along the eastern flank of NATO. It will have to, it will have two more NATO members in the north, more borders, at least 1,300 kilometers longer border with Russia. And that means more involvement, more engagement, more training, more of everything, but, facing stronger Russia. And that is a huge problem. Now, going to, from Europe to India, here we saw a clear realpolitik example. If you have to feed 1.5 billion people, and you have to make sure that your people, come first in a situation where this government is very much, counting on stability, that they were facing elections they are facing elections every year. Right now, when I was in India, they had elections in 3 provinces, and they are definitely on the rise. It clearly shows that you go to everywhere where you can get cheap fossil fuels everywhere. And here, by the way, it's not just about the cheap Russian fossil fuels. I mean, this strategic partnership between India and Russia goes back to the time of the Cold War. It actually stood the time of the Cold War. And it was the Soviet Union that has perpetually provided support to the Indian position on the Kashmir issue within the UN Security Council, even during the time when the West actually was betting on Pakistan. So I was trying to explain this to Western decision makers prior to the beginning of the war, that when it comes to the international isolation, the so-called international isolation, because the discussions about possible sanctions, the discussion about, how to engage partners around the world in the possibility of a war, this was already being discussed in November, December. In 2021, and I was saying India is not going to give up on Russia, not just because of the cheap fossil fuels. It's much more than that. I mean, think about the fact that India is the biggest producer of wheat, as we know, and for this wheat, it also needs fertilizers. And where do these fertilizers come from? Even during the war, they actually, they practically sealed a deal of 2 billion in a kind of barter deal, because of the sanctions. India facilitated and made the international transport corridor, North-South transport corridor, that has been in the making and has been in negotiation for the last 20 years. It in fact became operative during the war because of the strategic necessity to, ship goods and enable flows. And now I've learned actually that they considered a second transport corridor via Armenia in order to, enter the Black Sea. So from the Indian Ocean to go through the choke points and then reach the Black Sea, Mediterranean, and then to reach the Black Sea via Armenia. So whenever there is a need or there is a will, there is a way, in a sense. So these things will further continue. What is also interesting is that, and this is, I think that this was the Russian rationale, the Russian calculus, that given this, bifurcation of the system, and given the tough choices that main geopolitical actors will have to, make, and given also the projections of the, ASEAN countries, India, China, and so on, there will be still high need for fossil fuels, at least in the next 10 to 20 years. No matter what the West is saying, this part of the world is going to need the fossil fuels. Yes, they will urge for a green transition. Yes, they will try to increase the share of renewables. At the very same time, they will need the fossil fuels. And
Velina,
that is the last point. So my questions now.
Yes, I'm in fact, when we get to the Q&A, I'm going to I'm going to follow the Native Association tradition of taking the first question myself, posing the first question myself. And the topic that you just mentioned, the green energy, I assure you that that's going to be a big part of that first question. So we'll have a chance to come back to that. But I do want to get your questions to Tracy and Ellen to draw them out a bit, because they are very expert and didn't have, I feel, enough time to spread their wings over the broader questions that you have so well elaborated. So please, would you put your questions to them? And then I underline that you all get to talk together without interruption for as long as you like. So no pressure.
So I have questions for both, for Tracy and Ellen. For Tracy, of course, my question goes back to Canada. Canada is a critical partner that can provide, as you've outlined, a lot when it comes to LNG. And I think that one of the questions, and this is a question to you, how do you actually assess the future role of Canada in, in practically this transitionary period in which, at least here in Europe, we defined LNG as, accessible fossil fuel, as a fossil fuel that is green enough for the energy transition. Do you think that because, honestly, Europeans will not be able to cover for the full spectrum of Russian gas supply? Do you think that this will put also Canada under pressure to deliver more? And Americans cannot also, cover the whole market, or do you think because of political, let's say, political messaging, the government will feel pressure to stick to the green agenda and will not be, let's say, eager to increase production, because we need to increase the production in order to get more LNG on the market, right? So what is your view on that? And also, how do you evaluate actually the possibility to diversify? I mean, in the case of Europe, what is your, as an external observer, what is your view on the way how Europe really can diversify away? Because in the short term, we cannot diversify away efficiently. We know that, and increasing the, shrinking demand is not going to be enough.
And you had a question for Ellen also?
Yes. Should I ask it?
Yes,
now?
yes, do it
yes.
now, and then
So,
we give them a chance.
Ellen, you covered Saudi, you are covering Saudi Arabia extensively, and Saudi Arabia is investing a lot also in, becoming a part of the green energy transition. So I would like to hear from you, what is your observation, how successful is now Saudi Arabia with this strategy, to move away from fossil fuels towards renewables, green cities, or all of this kind of new macro strategy that the Saudi leadership is propagating. Do you see actually any hurdles for that? I mean, how exactly is the Saudi leadership going to do that in the short term? I mean, I still think that fossil fuels will be a main source of revenue for for Saudi Arabia. And what is actually at the core of this, if you have any information, because we haven't heard a lot about this. I mean, we are listening to all these statements at the international conferences, but how exactly this is going to happen?
Yeah, I'll just interject, Tracy and Ellen, both of your presentations were very interesting from the standpoint of the fine-grained details and the numbers that you furnished. In this second round, following Velina's lead, you're invited to, zoom out again a little bit and speak qualitatively. You don't have to keep to the hard numbers, but speak qualitatively and probabilistically about the future.
Right.
Tracy first.
Okay. So, when we're talking about Canadian LNG, I mean, realistically, it's going to be very difficult because it's a catch-up situation right now, right? So Canada stood on the sidelines for so long that even though I think, we're going to need gas for the next 30, 40 years, I think it's going to be very difficult for Canada, again, to sort of catch up. And what we are seeing is really, it's the First Nations that are getting these projects through rather than the government, right? Which is very interesting. So
because they want the economic development, they want the jobs.
Right, exactly. And so I think that, you're going to have to continue, even though they're smaller projects, but I mean, they're getting around the federal government because they can, right? And they're able to do that, even though they have to go through, say, BC to get permitting and everything. So I think that's great news for, First Nations. But again, I think that it might be for Canada just for the future, maybe too little too late, unless we have a change of government completely and they and they kind of have a different shift, because we're already seeing problems between sort of the fossil fuel producing provinces and the federal government right now. And so that could, if that rift continues, we'll have to see if those provinces decide to sort of bypass the federal government if they can. But otherwise, I think, hopefully Canada can get some more capacity built out. That would be great. I just think that for right now, it's going to be very difficult. But it's good to see the First Nations are doing that. And then as far as we're talking about Europe is concerned, Europe took an entire step back with kind of their renewable goals after the invasion of Ukraine. They kind of had to, right? We saw the increase in coal use. We saw an increase in wood use. We have, I think that there are some, I think they should re-look at nuclear because, again, Germany's using more coal, for example, and yet still closing down their nuclear plants. And I think that you're already seeing kind of this rift between France and everybody else, particularly the Dutch, Germany, et cetera, about the nuclear deal. And it's very hard because that grid is so interconnected on the continent that there's a lot of infighting among the countries, and which also makes it difficult to get a lot of decisions done quickly. So I think that
Tracy, I promise I'm sorry to interrupt. I promise we come back to this in my first Q&A, in my first question. I wanted to just add one explanatory note to what you said, if I may, that why Canada too little too late is because the natural gas development projects require large amounts of investment, which require assured return on investment, because the companies, if they are private Western companies, have fiduciary legal responsibilities to their stockholders to make good business decisions, and therefore they won't undertake such a project unless there's a guaranteed at least 15 to 20 year long-term contract for sales, because then that's the only way that they can guarantee a return on their investment. And so you gave the example of Chancellor Schultz, who came to Canada and didn't get a deal. He went to Mexico, he went to Qatar, and he's signing long-term contracts, so that Canada is being fenced out, or is fencing itself out, because once the long-term contracts are signed, then the market available to Canadian gas exports is diminished. And I just wanted to clarify for the audience that this is why you said too little too late. And I see you're nodding in agreement. So I'm just going to go to Ellen now to answer Velina's question, and then the three of you can continue discussing it. But caveat, don't talk about green and nuclear yet, because that's going to be the first question in the Q&A I'm going to pose, and then and that'll kick it off.
Okay, so I'm going to just briefly address Valina's question about Saudi Arabia and its green energy commitments, basically with the answer that it's a lot of talk and not a lot of action. Saudi Arabia's economy depends on oil production. It has definitely diversified, like I said, not just selling crude oil, but it produces all sorts of petroleum products and chemicals, and it's got lots of joint ventures with various, in various petroleum-related areas in, South Korea and China and the United States. And so it's diversified a lot within its core industry. But Saudi Arabia is not going to become, a big tourist destination. It's not going to become a big producer of medical supplies or car manufacturer. This is just not what, it's just not going to happen. And so Saudi Arabia wants to diversify itself within the energy field, which it's definitely working towards producing more natural gas. Right now, Saudi Arabia's natural gas production is all associated natural gas, which it mostly captures and feeds into its master gas system and uses for either chemicals production or for its own power generation. Now, they would like to become producers of natural gas outside of associated gas. That's gas that's produced when you drill for oil. So rather than just flaring it and polluting, they capture it, they put it into pipelines, and they feed it into their system, which has been great, by the way, for Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia used to burn a lot of crude oil for electricity, and now it can use this natural gas, which is both better economically and in terms of pollution. But so they're definitely expanding and diversifying in the energy sphere. I think that they are being more successful in the gas area than they are in the renewables area. Certainly, everyone looks at Saudi Arabia and says, "Hey, why don't they have tons of solar farms all over Saudi Arabia? It's desert, there's lots of sun, it's very hot." I think that you have to look at the limitations of the technology in these areas. And yeah, you could build a giant solar farm out in the middle of nowhere in Saudi Arabia, but there are a lot of limitations to these technologies. So like for a solar thermal plant, a lot of these plants take outside sources of energy just to get them going. And so there's definitely been a lot of delays. They've definitely tender projects for wind farms and solar farms, to play like Aqua Power is doing these things, but we're really talking about a very small percentage of energy generation compared to what they generate, from natural gas. And so it's really, I don't see it's in its infancy because it's not, it's just not a major component. And yes, they talk about it so much. They talk about decarbonization. They talk about the circular carbon economy, where they're actually very invested in carbon capture. I'd say they're betting more on carbon capture as a successful technology and a success becoming economical than they are on, big time renewable and battery storage,
Okay, well,
which
Ellen,
makes sense.
I'd like to thank you. You'll get to continue, I promise. But I'd like to thank you, in fact, for introducing the first question, which I've said more than once by NAOC tradition falls to the moderator. It is just to continue to say that we've talked about a lot of things. We've talked about Canadian natural gas, Europe's natural gas and oil sector. We've talked about Russia's war on Ukraine. We have only begun in the second round to talk about solar and wind and nuclear and hydroelectric energy. So I'm going to go in reverse order now. I'm going to pose the same question to Velina and then Ellen and then Tracy, and then the three of you get to talk amongst each other, or if you jump in earlier, I'm not going to stop you doing that either. But what about it? There are people in Europe, and we'll focus, because this is the NATO Association of Canada, focus mainly on the NATO countries in Europe, but not to the exclusion of Saudi Arabia or India or China or Russia. But there are those in Europe who say, oh my goodness, we'll never accomplish the just transition to carbon neutrality because all of a sudden we don't have Russian gas, and we need to depend more on fossil fuels than on petrochemical energy than we expected to. Then there are others who say this is a good thing because that was pie in the sky anyway. It was never going to happen. It takes more money to build less energy that's less reliable if you go with wind and solar in particular, and not to mention the ecological damage that's done by the need to mine the natural resources, which are mainly done in the former European colonies in Africa. So Velina, there's this debate that's going on of this sense. Tell us from the standpoint of your, perhaps from the standpoint of your bifurcation of Europe that you spoke to, that you introduced, and also of the European energy policy in general. What do we have to look forward to in wind and solar and nuclear and hydroelectric energy? Of course, Quebec has 97.5% of its electricity generated by hydropower. I just had to say that, so I'm very happy for it. But not every place in the world has that. Please take the topic. It's a wide topic that there could be a whole separate webinar on, but please address it in the context of what you've already said: wind, solar, nuclear, hydroelectric, and European energy security, please.
Yes, as a geopolitical strategist, I need to take a look at the macro perspective, at the helicopter view. And here we have a big geopolitical elephant in the room when it comes to the energy transition in Europe. And this is the upcoming dependence on China. Beijing controls 60% of the world's rare earths production. It holds an even bigger 90% share of global processing capacity of rare earths. And produces.
And now you're speaking about wind and solar technologies now.
Well, these are the rare earths that we need for the exactly for this kind of production,
right.
And for
just
this
wanted
kind
to
of
make that clear to the audience. Please go ahead.
Yes. So I'm specifically now touching upon the even bigger dependence, because right now what Europeans are actually going to do is to replace one dependence, that is the dependence on Russia. Let's say we have somehow already reduced successfully this dependence with another dependence, and that is the dependence on rare earths coming from China. And in the European case, because you asked me about the energy transition here in Europe. I mean, China produces virtually all 98% of the European Union's permanent magnets. So we are dependent currently to 98%.
And what are the magnets required for?
Well, practically for, you know, the supply of all these critical raw materials are absolutely important for, you know, the
No,
batteries, for
the magnets go in the batteries. They go in the windmills. They go
exactly
in
the solar panels, in the
green
photovoltaic.
hydrogen, and all of that.
Yes, yes, practically for every single sector of the green transition, we are dependent, like I said, to 98%. It's very important, and I really want this to be known, because even European citizens do not know that. So energy transition is a very costly process. We've seen this in the past with the so-called Energiewende. This was the famous transition project of Germany, of the German government, to, you know, speed up, to amplify the transition, you know, the energy transition at home. And we have already numbers that this is going to be a very costly, you know, process. And Tracy said at the beginning of her presentation that you know, industrial countries were betting on cheap energy. Cheap energy was at the core of the industrial welfare systems in the West. This is no longer to be the case. I mean, even that now we are being told that, okay, there are more investments in the renewables sectors. There are, you know, more, well, the prices are shrinking and they are becoming more available for the common citizens. There is a price hidden behind it. And of course, we know for a fact that, I mean, at least all future scenarios are pointing to an increased, I mean, we talk about 25 times, for instance, an increase of, for instance, the share of lithium, or 5 to 10 times increase of the share of cobalt. But I think that these are even numbers that are not really reflecting the reality. When it comes to, you know, the energy transition, we are going to see immense multiplicative effects of the use of these minerals and rare earths. And the geopolitical analysts know that every time when it is about the access of a new natural, you know, of a new raw material, it is always linked to military tensions, to conflicts. Robert, you mentioned also that some of these are.
Velina, I just got a message from Ellen that she's going to have to leave us sooner rather than later. We can all keep going for as long as you will hold out, and I'm sure that Dr. DeSalpio has collected some questions, but before Ellen leaves us for other obligations, she should have, I wanted to give her the opportunity to intervene in the discussion, and then we can return to these other matters.
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly on the rare earths issue, which I think is a huge issue, in the fact that China really does control most of the market on that, even for things that are being mined elsewhere, like in Africa. A lot of these are being done by Chinese companies, so they control the supply chain here. I think that it would be better if Europe and other places that have really banked on like electric cars somehow, you know, saving the climate, to realize that this is not a panacea. These, you know, it destroys and pollutes the environment just to mine these minerals and make these cars. Just because you're not seeing emissions at the tailpipe doesn't mean there aren't a lot of emissions along the way. And, you know, maybe this isn't the best, you know, use of all of the energy and all of the investment are in, you know, cars that run on batteries that are made from lithium and cobalt and other minerals that are are both largely controlled by China, but also are not very clean to create. I mean, there's also a question of what's going on with all these batteries after they lose their charge. I mean, we all know that batteries degrade over time. What's happening with all this? What's happening with the broken windmill parts? I mean, these are things that, and perhaps this strategy, stop banking just on renewable and solar, wind, and electric vehicles, because that's not what's going to save us. The better thing would be to just diversify all across the board. More nuclear, more gas, even some coal when it's necessary, cleaner ways of burning oil. Maybe carbon capture is the way to go. Maybe the Saudis are right on this. I'm not saying that I have the answer, but that just pivoting towards this idea that electric vehicles and wind and solar are the only options here, I think is incredibly short-sighted and is not going to achieve any of the stated goals. Some people will become very rich, and maybe that's really their goal, but it's not going to save the environment. It's not going to make people, better or safer or anything like that. So, that's kind of my overall thoughts on the renewable energy situation and its role. Don't just, go from one dependency on Russian energy to dependency on something else. Hopping around from dependency to dependency is not going to make anyone safer, more secure, or have a better environment.
Thank you, Ellen. Tracy, I saw you nodding in agreement while Ellen was talking.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, what we're trying to do is not, what we've seen throughout history is an evolution of energy, right? And industrialization. What we're trying to do at this point is to skip the whole evolution part and just go straight to, renewables. That's not a natural progression of how things, of how humans evolve and how technology evolves, right? That's just not the natural progression to jump into something that is just not there technologically speaking, right? We just don't have, batteries aren't there yet. Wind and solar are intermittent. So I think that that's a big problem as far as when Ellen mentioned, just jumping from one dependency to another dependency. It's really, I think, because at the heart of that is because it's a non-natural evolution of technology to begin with. But, and then as far as what Velina was talking about, I think we also have this huge problem, where, well, let's talk about China in general, right? This huge dependency we have on China for, wind, solar, rare earths. We now have Europe and the United States coming up with their own, we have the Inflation Reduction Act, and Europe's coming up with sort of their own part to that, and where they're saying we want 10% of these renewable minerals mined in Europe specifically, and then the United States has their own, in the United States specifically. And the problem is that you can't permitting and bureaucratic tape to get these mines even done is long enough that forget your 2035 goals, forget your 2040 goals. You're lucky if you get this done by, it takes 10 years in the US just to get a permit. And that's before all the legal battles. Then you get all your legal battles because you have environmentalists, and Europe takes twice as long as that. And so I just think we have these unrealistic goals.
Thanks for that, Tracy. Any last comments amongst the three of you before we go to the Q&A? Actually, I'll go directly to the Q&A because it's only a continuation of what you've already started to talk about, which are the renewables. And I believe that I have already actually directly asked that question to inaugurate the Q&A. It was such a seamless transition that I wasn't sure whether I had actually asked the question, but I recall now that I have. And so it's now my pleasure to hand the baton off to Dr. DeSapio, who has been meticulously inspecting and evaluating the questions that have been dropped into the YouTube chat. And Ellen, if you have to go anytime soon, you can just go, and I will try to pick up the slack, although I don't rival your knowledge in certain sectors of the energy universe. I will.
I can take one question, and then I have to.
Okay, Joe, is there a question that's specifically directed toward Ellen?
Yes, there is. If you'll just give me 1 second, I will call it up. Ellen, from one of our posters, they wondered if China has an SPR that they can use when their demand for oil increases this year. Will they tap some sort of strategic petroleum reserve?
That's a great question. And China does have a strategic petroleum reserve. It's not like the US strategic petroleum reserve that is done in accordance with the International Energy Association's guidelines. It's its own reserves, and they build a whole lot of it. I think they would prefer not to have to tap it, but they certainly will. I know there have been a lot of debates in the Twitter sphere about when and under what conditions China might tap its crude oil reserve, but that's definitely a possibility. I think that though they recognize that they have a very robust business importing crude oil, refining it, and selling it, and that's not something they necessarily want to tap their reserves for. But I'm also going to turn that over to Tracy, because she can probably give a really good answer about China's strategic reserve. And with that, I'm going to say I really enjoyed hearing from all of the panelists, and I apologize for having to go for another commitment. But thank you very much for the opportunity.
Very glad you could be here, Ellen. Thanks, and hope to have you again. Tracy, Ellen turned it over to you.
Well, I think she covered China pretty well. Obviously, they have a huge strategic reserve. They're actually building more reserve out. It's kind of murky as far as what the exact number of that is, because although we have satellite images of what is above ground, we have no idea what is below ground. That said, I don't think that, they're not going to be the United States and drain their entire reserve, because gas prices are a little bit high. Let's put it that way. And they have at times tapped it, but they tend not to draw that down much at all.
Okay, thanks. Joseph, we have more questions.
We do indeed.
It's yours now. I'm not going to intervene. I'm not going to say if we have any more questions. It's your ball. Your ball is in your court now.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Cutler. One of the posters had a question for Tracy, and they wondered if you could just touch base more about the US natural gas storage system. Are you seeing any storage reduction with the Freeport export terminal reopening? Or do you see a natural gas input increasing to Freeport?
So that would be, Freeport was shut down for a fire in August, and this has been the longest reopen in history. I will just say that. There's been many, many problems. But yeah, as far as Freeport is concerned, what that is an export facility. And so a lot of the reasons why we saw sort of depressed natural gas is because after Freeport went down is because gas was trapped in the United States, right? It had nowhere to go. So as far as Freeport reopening, they do have 2 trains running. There's 3. So we are starting to see that facility start to move again. It's still not 100% as of yet. And we're seeing some cargoes canceled and things of that nature because they're running into some problems. But, I think once that reopens, that would be, a very good sign for, we might see a little bounce in US natural gas prices at that point. And of course, all the LNG build out that is happening right now to LNG facility build out in the Gulf.
Okay.
I hope that answered the question.
That That was quite comprehensive. Thank you. Along with that, the same poster wonders for both of you, in fact, if you would offer any prediction for what sort of oil prices we might see in the short term, because they were quoted $116 a barrel this particular year.
Velina.
Well, Velina, I'm not the energy expert speaking. I'm the geopolitical expert speaking, and I argued that, I mean, I belong to those who are convinced or think that we are going to still see actually a high oil price, in a sense that we have already decreased production on the one hand. We have a lot of distortion on the supply side. The very same time, I just see how an energy hungry old continent is going to get enough so the oil price. But from geopolitical point of view now, of course, I will hand it over to Tracy, who is the energy expert.
I really don't like giving energy prices any close to far out, because there's so many mitigating factors going on in the energy industry and so many geopolitical things that you have to watch out for that could happen. So, I really try to refrain from giving any sort of oil price, because there's just too much that's happening globally, again, geopolitically, and global oil flows. And so I'm sorry, guys, but I really don't want to put a number on it. Here's what I will say. I think we're higher for longer. And I will say that because of the fact that, we've had 7 years of basically no investment from the industry globally, very little investment, I should say, very little capital expenditure, and we have growing demand. And so I think that's led us to a place that it's going to be higher for longer.
Fair enough.
Great, thanks very much. Another viewer asks, there's a project to supply solar power from Australia to Singapore. They're not 100% certain about that, but is such a project feasible? And if so, does that mean there could be similar projects, for instance, to supply solar power from North Africa to Europe, perhaps including solar farms in the Sahara?
Well, the short answer is yes. There is a lot right now going on when it comes to connectivity from Europe to North Africa, and vice versa. And not only when it comes to green energy, but also, green hydrogen also, but also fossil fuels still very much dependent. The very fact that we haven't developed the pipelines yet, for instance, when it comes to Spain, where there is actually a capacity of up to 60 BCM that could, add to the energy mix, but hasn't been built because of, the security of the pipeline network with Russia. So I suppose that there will be, that there will be more investments and more happening when it comes to this kind of projects. But at the very same time, I need to point to the volatility of the Mediterranean basin, the volatility of the situation in the North African countries. We've seen a kind of Arab Spring 2.0 scenario in fact, last time in December 2021, before the beginning of the war, by the way, when, the food index reached the same levels as in 2011. And there is always this kind of, situation where you could end up in a political vacuum. So yes, a lot is going on right now in Morocco, in Algeria. To some extent, of course, these countries are already making a lot of projects, energy projects from Europe. and it is a natural way to happen. So in a sense, Libya, of course, is going to be also critical for the energy mix when it comes to, supply, oil supply, as we've seen also from the charts Ellen provided.
Thank you very much. I believe Robert had a follow-up he wanted to address.
Well, yes, I just to mention on this, Australia's Singapore project is new to me. It seems like it's rather a long distance, just conceptualizing a globe. And while it's true that there is and has been over the years a good deal of solar power development from North Africa for transmission to Europe, one has to look at the cost and the cost effectiveness of these projects. I am particularly looking at, every day I look at the Caspian region, including the South Caucasus and Central Asia. And not long ago, actually, I think von der Leyen herself went to the region, and there was a memorandum of understanding signed for Azerbaijan to export. They're going to build wind and solar in the liberated territories that they recaptured 2.5 years ago, and that there will be a cable that is planned that this will be transmitted, doesn't go by microwave, you have to lay a cable through Georgia, under the Black Sea to Romania. And a great deal of diplomatic brouhaha was made about this. But when you look at the technical specifications of the cable and the amount of electricity, not even counting what could be lost in the process of transmission, that the amount of electricity arriving in Romania will be the equivalent of 3 billion cubic meters of natural gas per year, which is not nothing for countries with small demand because they have small populations, such as exist in the Balkans, but it is next to nothing compared to your larger projects for natural gas, which typically have a minimum, unless you're talking about interconnectors in Eastern Europe, which is a whole different story. You're talking about exploiting gas that's in the ground, minimum of 8 to 10 billion cubic meters per year, and a standard for a long duration is 30 or 31 BCM, billion cubic meters per year. Tracy, I'm sorry, I don't recall exactly how many cubic feet that is, but if I recall correctly, there's like 33 or so cubic feet per cubic meter, so you can do the math. And it's just a question, and they even signed, the EU even signed a memorandum of understanding with Kazakhstan for Kazakhstan. A memorandum of understanding, of course, means nothing. Right. It's not a commitment, it's not an investment. It's a piece of paper with 2 signatures on it, saying that Kazakhstan, that the European Union looks forward to receiving electricity from Kazakhstan generated likewise by wind energy. How are they going to label? Where are they going to lay the cable? How it's going to go under the Caspian? Where it's going to arrive across? I mean, it's rather fantastic, which I use as the adjectival form of the noun fantasy. It's rather fantastic.
Yeah, I know this project. I just wanted to jump in there really fast. This project that they're talking about, the solar project, I know a little bit about it. Basically, this is so they think it's going to cost $8 billion, which you and I know that never happens. Nothing comes in on budget on that, but for only 800 megawatts of power. So, realistically, the cost benefit analysis on this is wildly off the mark. So I will be very surprised if this project even gets done.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yes, thank you, Joseph. Because it's only because Ellen disappeared that I took the opportunity to intervene. I usually like to be quiet and relax during this part of the program, but again, Joseph, you are the MC pro tempore, and please continue to pose questions so long as the panelists and the audience will tolerate it. Please continue to and so long as Robert Baines will tolerate it, please continue to pose questions from the audience.
That might be the one right there, the last one. I have only one question remaining.
Okay.
They wondered if instead of diversification through energy type for baseload generation, if it would make sense to diversify energy generation to specific regions rather than have a sort of single universal policy. In other words, all wind must be good all the time, or all coal must be bad all the time. Would it make more sense to actually have specific geographic regions depend specifically on certain sources of energy?
Anyone want to pick up small nuclear reactors?
Well, I'm totally in favor of small nuclear reactors, even though that I'm being based in Austria, and Austria vehemently against nuclear power, civilian nuclear, power. And I actually, if I were to consult my government here in Austria, I would be very blatant and open about it, that this is not how actually a country enables diversified energy mix. So in a sense, this proposal makes makes sense that it makes sense that we consider certain regions which, for instance, enable the solar production or the wind production or hydropower production, like in the case of Austria. Electricity is being produced thanks to hydropower. We are at the among the front runners, at the forefront of the electricity production by hydropower. At the very same time, we are still, after 30 months also, with a very high share of Russian gas, which currently is at 70% share of our gas imports comes from Russia, and we need it also for the grid system. So the grid system cannot rely only on the electricity that is being produced by hydropower. So just to give you one example, it makes sense to sum it up, that you have regions which rely on one source. At the very same time, we will not overcome, at least I can speak for Europe, we will not overcome certain conflict lines, like the division between the nuclear and the non-nuclear block. We will not overcome this. I think that we have to compromise and to accept, and it is in a sense, I think, ingenuine, because even Austria imports electricity from neighbors who produce it with the help of nuclear power. Mm-hmm. So it's an ingenuine kind of debate, which is very much based on political peculiarities, because I know for a fact that here, for instance, in Austria, no government can win elections if it says, okay, we want actually to add nuclear to the energy mix. No government will win elections. It is about political peculiarities in a sense. So in general, yes, I see a geopolitical sense in this proposal. But then I would also argue that a lot about the energy dependencies here in Europe are linked to self-inflicted pain. We still have a lot of fossil fuels reserves. We can also start fracking if we decide. We can do that. We can actually have more oil, more gas, more nuclear power production, next to increasing the share of renewables, just in order to solve our issues in the short term. And that means, for instance, if we lack 40 BCM and we cannot find them on the markets, instead of, as it was outlined, instead of actually taking away the LNG from other international customers that are no longer able to afford themselves such high prices like we do, 5 times, 6 times the price that they were used to import the LNG. We could also produce. I mean, it makes, from a geopolitical point of view, it makes perfect sense to say so. But no government in Europe, almost no government would actually, would
Well,
risk
let me put a question
do
to you
so.
on the basis of what you said before Tracy gets to answer Joseph's intervention, which is it's this. You mentioned you've been speaking a great deal about Austria, which is natural since you live there and know and consult there. But is it the case, as it's been alleged, that over the years, not just today, but over the years, many of the anti-nuclear NGOs and politicians and many of the pro-wind and pro-solar politicians and lobbyists have in fact been funded by Russia because they know that this would have increased European dependence on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if it had entered into service, and Nord Stream 1, and that if it's the case that nuclear is disfavored, and if it's the case that wind and solar require higher levels of investment for lower levels of energy efficiency, then this would increase the dependence on Russia. And there's this case, I don't know how typical it is, but this case that you know about, it's been reported around, the NGO in Mecklenburg in Germany, where the minister is on record as saying, "Oh, I'm sorry, we lost the tax, those tax declarations that you wanted to look at to see whether Russia had funded this NGO that was really a gongo, government organized NGO. I'm sorry, we've lost those tax declarations. We can't tell you one or the other." So is this the case? Is this like a general long-term strategy that Russia has had, or is that just a conspiracy theory?
Well, I myself haven't conducted that kind of research so that I can speak from personal experience on that matter, but it seemed a very plausible assumption to me, given my experience with the way how Russia has been penetrating Western societies, political systems, industries, and economic sectors over the last 30 years. So it seems quite plausible that when you deal with open political systems, so with open economic sectors, we have this famous liberal market model, we have open societies, we have open democratic system. It's quite plausible to me to use this leverage and to try to penetrate these systems, for instance, to let's say erase a competition coming from another state, another energy project, be it in the gas sector or in the nuclear or whatsoever. And this is one way how you could do it. I mean, it's quite, I would say, cheap investment. And if you take a look, that there were many former chancellors, foreign ministers,
Gerhard Schröder is the
key figures in in all European, few exceptions, who
if Velina doesn't come back,
and that means per se by the security services. It's, I think, a presumption that makes a lot of sense.
Well, thanks, Velina. I see that we're rounding up almost to 2 hours, which is about the limit of panelists' energy and audience attention span. Tracy should have the opportunity to respond to Joseph's last question, if Joseph wishes to restate it, unless Tracy remembers it. And then I will hand it back to Robert Baines for any final remarks.
There is one question remaining in the chat that came in, if Tracy would like to answer that one. a two-part question.
Oh, no.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this poster wonders what you think of the Canadian wood pellet exports to Europe. And the second part is, since fossil fuels cause so much damage to the environment, what will nuclear do? In other words, do the benefits of things like SMRs outweigh the downstream pollutant effects?
Well, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with Canada's wood pellet industry. My focus is really on natural gas and oil and coal. But so I'm afraid I can't answer that question.
A one-part question then. Very good.
And then it was, what was the second question?
Second question was whether reliance on nuclear would be have as many problems for pollution as reliance on oil and gas would.
Oh, well, absolutely not, because, well, you know, you're talking about something that's much cleaner burning, and it's all about fuel density, right? And that's why oil is so great. It's very dense and it creates a lot of energy. And when you are talking about nuclear, you take that and shrink it by about 1 million times, right? It takes a very, very, very little uranium to create a whole lot of energy. And so, and it's very clean burning. The problem that most people have, or that people that push against nuclear, is because of the nuclear waste, right? That everybody's afraid of radioactive waste and what to do with it, and how to store old nuclear reactors, which what they do is they envelop them in cement and bury them. But so, you know, I think if people took
which is what they do with wind turbine blades.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So I think if the people really, I mean, nuclear is a whole nother conversation to get into, but I think that if you sort of really look into the efficiency, and I would suggest everybody go and look into the efficiency, especially with these smaller nuclear reactors, you'll find that it's very clean burning. It's you know, it works wonders, right? I mean, you can get a lot of energy from a very little amount of material with very little waste.
And the nuclear industry is the only energy industry that controls its waste products all the way down the line.
Right, all the way down the power chain. So you know, again, it's a whole nother conversation, but I think you should get up on it. But it's definitely, you know, it's definitely cleaner burning than oil or coal or natural gas, obviously.
And is it also more economical?
Well, obviously, yeah, because you're talking, because it's the density, it's about energy density, right? And so again, you're using very little material to create a whole lot of energy.
So all you need, in other words, you need only one reactor instead of a bunch of pipelines and some furnaces, basically, right. Is what, yeah. Okay. Well, that seems to, correct me if I'm wrong, Joseph, that's exhausted our questions, probably exhausted our panelists. And we're just at an hour and 58 minutes. It's as if this was preordained for me to hand the baton back to Robert Baines for any final comments, or as he sometimes does, is he then hands it back to me. But because he introduced the webinar, it is his prerogative to close it.
Yes, thank you so much, Robert. Well, it's only left to me to thank an outstanding panel. Ellen, unfortunately not here anymore, but Tracy and Relina, an absolute pleasure. What a great discussion. I love being able to see the actual sausage being made in the room between experts who are passionate, knowledgeable, and can clearly engage with the ideas from different points of view. And that's all because of our dear senior fellow, Robert Cutler. Thank you so much, Robert, for putting this together. Dr. Joseph DeSapio, thank you so much for helping to field the questions and to make sure that the tech works. All those who are watching, please do subscribe to us on YouTube.
And I'll say that You can also follow all of us and any of us on Twitter. Tracy,
Indeed.
Velina, Ellen, and I, we're all on Twitter, and you just look for us and you can follow us.
It is a bit of a Twitter dream team. So please do follow us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, all of the fun platforms.
And the NAOC on Twitter, of course.
Exactly. But the key is that the conversation never ends. It is an ongoing feast. Thank you
That's
so much
true.
for being part of it. And yeah, we really appreciate it and look forward to our next discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you, Velina and Tracy.